We all have challenges in life: sadness, broken relationships, anger, bullying, grief, and isolation. But there is hope. Together, we can learn how to bring back joy, re engage with life, restore relationships, and to be alone without being lonely. Welcome to Psychology Talks.
We have with us Bill Burrow today, and so we are welcoming him back, and he's going to be talking to us about depression and how we treat that. And so Dr. Burrow is the Director of Health and Counseling at George Fox University, or has been for a number of years. He's also led clinical teams there at George Fox in their clinical psychology program, and he's currently the CAPS president, which is the Christian Association for Psychological Studies. Thanks for being with us again.
It's good to be with you again.
Last time you were here with us, we talked quite a bit about the integration of psychological studies and mental health. And so today we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about depression in general. And so, not in general, specific.
Specific, okay.
So why don't we start there?
Well, why don't we start by talking about what depression is? Yeah. So depression is one of those things that actually impacts a lot of people in America every year. I think the national statistics are about 1 in 10 people per year will experience major depressive disorder. So it's pretty pervasive. But depression functions on a continuum, right? We have mild depression, which is annoying, but it doesn't really get in the way all that much of day-to-day living. Then you have the more moderate phases of depression where it's kind of getting in the way, but you're still able to keep the balls up in the air with the different things you've got to do, whether it's work or school or the things you've got to do at home. And then you have severe major depressive disorder, and this one's really bad. This is when it's just like impossible to get out of bed for days, and you're not eating at all, and it's just really a problem just in normal everyday functioning. So you have these different levels of depression that people experience, but the common symptoms along with depressed mood are there's appetite changes, sleep disturbance, either sleeping too much or not sleeping enough or not able to get to sleep. Oftentimes people will isolate from others, they'll kind of withdraw into themselves. You lose motivation to just do everyday tasks, and oftentimes they'll even lose the motivation to do things that used to bring them pleasure in life, so things they really enjoy doing. Suicidal ideation is frequently associated with depressive disorder, but and it's experienced different ways by different people. So some folks, they're not feeling sad, but they have a lot of these other symptoms, so it's more of a depressed thinking way or a way of interacting with the world. But other people are just really, really sad and depressed, and they're experiencing it more on an emotional level. So it plays out different ways for different people, but it's pretty debilitating for a lot of folks and costs billions of dollars a year to the United States, both in terms of the care for these people as well as just lost work productivity and those kinds of things, because it can be really pretty challenging.
And not to mention some of the personally devastating losses that people can have along with depression. Maybe they're the cause for depression, but maybe they're the result of it, like losing relationships.
Right. Yeah, so oftentimes, sometimes we have a depressed episode, but we kind of know why we're having it. It's sort of like for a good reason. A number of years ago, I had a period of time when I got depressed, but I'd just gone through a medical crisis with my wife in the prior 12 months. And even though that had kind of resolved favorably, it's kind of like after it was all done, it's like my body just said, okay, now it's your turn to crash and burn, which was no fun whatsoever. And it lasted for a couple months, but I did a lot of the things that I tell my clients to do. And even though I didn't see a lot of improvement initially, I knew I needed to keep doing them. And if I kept doing it, it would start to lift. And it did after a couple months.
Yeah, absolutely. Just like you experienced that period of time where you had to really overcome and incorporate a lot of the techniques that you, like you said, teach your clients about. I think we all have those things, regardless of whether or not we're psychologists or just an everyday person who knows nothing about psychology. And so, I know I myself have had those kinds of experiences. I would say, I experienced a miscarriage and had to incorporate all of those same kinds of things. I had to get with my support network. I had to experience and deal with the grief of losing a child. And there's still times that come up for me around that. And I think for a lot of people in everyday situations. So what are some of those techniques?
Well, as we mentioned in our prior show, if people happen to see that, I start with my basics, and my basics are I've got to make sure I'm sleeping well. And sometimes that's a problem because one of the symptoms of depression is that you're not sleeping, the right way. So a routine bedtime and a routine getting up time in the morning. There's apps on our phones now that will tell us, okay, go to bed now and get up now. But doing it at the same time every day helps us get into a pattern, along with sleep. Another thing that helps a lot is...
Can we stick with sleep for just a minute?
Sure.
Yeah, so why don't we talk a little bit about sleep hygiene and what that is?
Yeah, and so with sleep, one of the things we want to be aware of is not having too much caffeine later in the day. So if we're having a hard time getting to sleep, if the problem is getting to sleep, we want to back that caffeine up earlier and earlier in the day before we start having it anymore. Making the room as dark as we possibly can that we're sleeping in. Not doing screens, TVs, laptop computers, our cell phone, because all of our screens are so bright now, they actually kind of trick the brain into thinking it's daytime. So it's harder for the brain to just kind of go down. So turning the TV or the devices off, a good hour before you're trying to go to sleep will help if you're having problems getting to sleep.
What about that person that says, but I need music to fall asleep, or I need to listen to television in order to get to sleep?
Yeah, well, it doesn't work very well for people, particularly if they're having sleep problems, right? So we have to turn it off. But you can set a timer on your TV. So a lot of TVs have a timer on them, so they will turn off after 30 minutes. So if you want to do that for 30 minutes, but you're having a hard time going to sleep, you should back that turning the devices off up earlier so that your body is just kind of naturally thinking, oh, it's time to go to bed.
Well, and there has been some research that's come out about even having devices on in the room.
Right. And if you, they have, wave machines and those kinds of things. If you like that, if that's soothing for you, I find them just loud. But if that helps you sleep, or white noise like a fan going on in the room, a number of people will find that to be helpful. Also, having your room temperature being a little on the cool side helps people sleep versus too warm. If you start to get cold in the middle of the night, you can always throw another blanket on, but having a little bit more on the cool side helps. So all of those things and having a routine, it's almost like when we think about putting children to bed, how if you have a bedtime routine, you can actually almost train your child to just go to sleep by doing the same thing every single night so they can start to put themselves to bed almost. And we can do the same thing with ourselves as adults. We're not used to doing it that way, but if you're having problems sleeping, it's a great way to go. You set this routine up that just kind of is telling your body by all these different things that you're doing, it's like, oh, the bedtime and the sleep time is coming, and those things help.
What about the person who has sleep interruption?
The person that wakes up in the middle of the night that has a hard time falling back asleep, that's sort of a little bit of a different situation. So when that happens, obviously, getting up and turning the TV on is not going to help because now you've got something for your brain to think about. So if you do anything, what we recommend is that, roll over, try to go back to sleep again, but don't do that for too long. If it's 15, 20 minutes, get up, go do something, but not something that's terribly interesting, and then put yourself to bed again, right? And then try to get to sleep again. One of the things that helps a lot with this is exercise, because if your body's physically tired, it's going to sleep better. So making sure that you're exerting some energy during the day, just kind of tiring yourself out physically will help you get to sleep and stay asleep a little bit better.
Okay. And so I interrupted you there. You were talking about some other techniques that you would tell people about how to address depression and those bouts of sadness that come with just everyday life experiences that people encounter.
Right. So some of the other things, so sleep is one, making sure you're eating well enough. So even if you don't feel like eating, making sure you get nutrition, right? Because the brain needs energy. Food is fuel. So you have to eat properly, and that goes to both what you're eating. It doesn't, you don't have to change your diet and make it super healthy if you're not used to eating that way, but healthy enough. And then not overeating either. It can be problematic. Oftentimes people kind of eat their emotions away, and that's not a good strategy to use either. So eating properly, and then I mentioned before exercise. So getting some energy, because it gets this stuff out of your system a little bit. And even when you're depressed, the last thing on the planet you want to do is exercise. Last thing on the planet you want to do is much of anything. But you have to believe that it's good for you. So you get up, you go out and do it, even though you don't want to. We call it behavioral activation in psychology. There's a number of things where if we actually engage in the behaviors even if we don't feel like it, our mood will follow. So this kind of falls under the heading of one of the sayings I like to use with clients, which is emotions are good slaves, but they're lousy masters. And when we let our emotions drive our lives, we have a really hard time maintaining a sense of stability because our emotions can be kind of erratic at times. Whereas if we put them kind of under the supervision, if you will, of our thoughts and using the reasoning skills that we have, we do much better.
And so one thing that we've talked about in the last program is integration of biblical studies. And so is there some scripture that you have that supports that?
Yeah, I think that there's, when you look at the Psalms, for example, one of the things I love about a number of them is when you look at sort of the beginning part of the Psalm, the psalmist is in this deep state of despair, right? They just feel awful. They feel like God has left them and all of their enemies are after them and all this kinds of stuff. But as you read the Psalm, you see this kind of gradual working through of the situation. And then oftentimes by the time you get to the end of the Psalm, there's this sort of awareness and acknowledgement of who the psalmist is as the creation, who God is as the creator, and sort of praising God for the fact that God has not left the psalmist even though he feels like he has, and that God is still looking out for him even though he feels like he's not looking out for him. So there's a recognition of what is happening, and it's different from what he perceives as happening at the beginning. So we see this transformation. So that's one of the things I think that's great about Scripture is it's not all that everything's perfect and lovely and wonderful all the way through. It's like, this was really bad. I mean, in places where David was writing the Psalm, you know, the king was out to kill him. So this was not a good situation. So there's this real life thing that's going on.
So what are some other techniques that people can do? We talked about behavioral activation. We talked about sleep. We talked about a little bit what behavioral activation is, which is really doing the thing that you don't want to do because it doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel good at the time to do those things. But what you're saying is those are exactly the things that you need to do in order to get through that period of sadness or through that period of demotivation.
Right. I mean, in some ways, it's almost like physical therapy. If you have an injury, the last thing you want to do is put weight on that injury and start working it out and stretching it and those kinds of things because it hurts and it's not fun and it takes time. But it's when you have that injury that it's essential that you do those things to get it healed up, to get full range of motion and those kinds of things. So on the mental health side, we're sort of doing the same thing. We're just using different strategies and different techniques to accomplish that. So those are things that are all really important. The other things with depression as well is depressed people tend to think in depressed ways. So one of the things in cognitive behavioral therapy that we talk about is, we talked about automatic thoughts last time and cognitive distortions, but there's also these things called schemas. Schemas are sort of these basic elements or ways that we view the world that are deeply, deeply entrenched inside of us. And as we discover them, sometimes they are good representations of how the world works, and other times they're really distorted ways of understanding how the world works.
Can you give an example?
Well, an example for a depressed person might be this thought, I'm going to be depressed the rest of my life, or I'm never going to get out of this hole, or nothing's ever going to go right for me, right? It's just this, it's a woe is me, but I'm always going to be in the bottom of this deep hole. Or nothing I do is going to make any difference, so why try? So these are all things that are very common for people that are depressed. I also, from a spiritual perspective, think that there's sort of this spiritual battle going on for our mind at that point in time because spiritual forces don't want us to get better. So those are things where we've got to look at and go, nope, that's not true. Well, I don't feel that if I try, I'm going to get better. I know that if I do this, I will get better. And we've got research to show this. So for example, we know that regular exercise does as well for depression as antidepressant medication. Now, one takes more work than the other one does. It's easy to take a pill. But we know that the exercise does just as well, if not better. So we have good research that shows that these things work, but we have to get the person motivated to do it. And that's the part that oftentimes is one of the hardest things to do. So with the schemas or these sort of deep-seated thoughts, it's looking at the thoughts that we have when we're depressed and going, okay, is that thought helping me or is it not helping me? And if it's not helping me, what do I need to change about it? Even if I don't believe it's true, even if everything in me emotionally is saying, nope, that's not going to make a difference, or it's not going to work, or it doesn't matter, you have to do the next right thing all the time. Not all the things, just what's the one thing you've got to do. Like I remember when I was feeling pretty depressed, I didn't want to go home at the end of the day because I had young children. I knew they were going to want to play with Dad, and Dad was out of gas. I just had nothing left. So it wasn't that I didn't like what was at home. I just had no energy left. But I needed to get in my car and drive home, and not get in my car and drive to the other coast, right?
Right.
Because,
So I mean, that puts it into a very practical way that the next right thing is something simple.
Yeah.
It's making the choice to eat. It's making the choice to get out of bed, to put clothes on and not stay in your jammies all day.
Right.
It's doing the very next practical thing that helps you to get on with life.
It is. It's get up, and take a shower, and put clothes on, and go about whatever the day holds for you. And if you are in a situation where you don't have things that you're missing by not engaging with things, then make some things up. So maybe you get up in the morning and you go to the library, and you read the paper, or you check out a book, or you listen to some music. But that just becomes, you create a routine for yourself, and you hold yourself in the routine. You make yourself do it over time, and it'll start to lift. It's when we just go, I'm just going to either literally or figuratively curl up in a ball and go in a corner and hope nobody bothers me, then you're not going to get much better.
Yeah. For those people that maybe didn't see the last episode where we talked about cognitive distortions, can we talk about that briefly?
Sure. So cognitive distortions are ways of viewing the world that we live in that are out of whack. They're not an accurate representation of how things actually work. I often will say that the average person needs to have a good understanding of who they are, who God is, and who others are, and then how those three interact with each other. And if we don't have a good understanding of those three things, or we don't really understand very well how those three things interact with each other, we're going to have trouble, because we're going about our life trying to engage with the world in ways that are not the way it's designed or the way it actually runs.
Right.
So one of my cognitive distortions might be, I think everybody should be nice to me all the time, or everybody's always going to be mean to me. Both of those are cognitive distortions. And the truth is that in an average day, living in the United States, depending on who you know, most people, if you're just out and about in the public, will be friendly enough. But somebody might be mean. So I don't avoid it because that one person might be mean one day. It's just that I need to think about the fact that, okay, if that person was mean to me, that's probably their stuff. It's not about me. And even if they try to make it about me, it's probably still not about me.
Right.
And I can move on and let that go.
Yeah. I often refer to that as factors of probability. So how likely is it that something's going to happen to me versus how oftentimes things do not happen to me?
Right.
So is the elevator really going to crash when I get in it? Well, how often has that happened? Not very often.
Yeah, and probably not. It's like a fear of flying, right?
Yeah.
I mean, your chances of having something, traumatic happen are much greater if you're just driving than they are getting on an airplane. But some people have a terrible fear of flying.
Right.
But driving is relatively safe for most people.
Relatively safe for most people. But it goes back to what you're talking about, just walking down the street.
Sure.
How often is the person next to you, as you're walking down the street, going to assault you? Hopefully not very often.
Right.
If it's happening too often, you might want to move.
Right.
Not a real safe place to live.
And one of the things that makes this really difficult for us in our culture today is that because of technology, because of the news feeds and our cell phones that have got wireless and all these kinds of things, every horrible thing that happens in the world is instantly in front of us.
Right.
So you think back 20 years ago, 30 years ago, if you happened to read the paper or if you happened to watch the nightly news, you would get exposed to stuff, but it wasn't constant. And now you're constantly being fed this stuff. And what winds up happening is we start to build beliefs around this going, oh, see, there it went again, there it went again, there it went again, there it went again. But it may not have happened within 2,000 miles of you, but it's reinforcing this idea that the planet is a very unsafe place.
Right.
This is one of the big things that's happening with our young people in the teenage years and moving into college, and why stress and depression are skyrocketing is because they have grown up believing and having sort of reinforced by all this information in front of them that the world is a terribly dangerous place. And their parents bought into this as well. 9/11 kind of got it started. The recession was another piece of it. The book, The Coddling of the American Mind, kind of traces this a little bit forward on how all of this concern and fear about things, because it was constantly being put in front of us, caused us to want to protect our young people and our sons and daughters and students as they were growing up. And it's not that there was anything wrong with the protection, except for the fact that they started to believe that they were terribly vulnerable all the time.
Yeah.
And therefore, they're afraid to try anything. They're very fearful as a cultural group, and they are tremendously fearful of failure. Whereas failure oftentimes, while it's unpleasant, is the thing that helps make us stronger, right? We kind of learn about ourselves in life, and we grow up, we pick ourselves up, and we go on. They've not had to pick themselves up, which then makes them more susceptible to the depression and the anxiety.
Okay. So that goes back to that schema that you were talking about, and also that cognitive distortion that maybe was developed because of this almost automatic fear that now they're experiencing all the time. So why don't we talk a little bit about that, about automatic thoughts, about how that might play into depression, and then how people can help get themselves out of it.
So the automatic thoughts are, again, sort of those knee-jerk reaction thoughts that we have to a circumstance. So I wake up in the morning and the automatic thought is, oh gosh, I just can't face the day, or I can't get through. I don't have the energy for this. I don't want to do it. Nothing good's going to happen today, so why try, and everything else. So that's the automatic thought. So at that time, as we said, so what we've got to do is but I've got to get up. I've got to get out of bed, and I'm going to go get dressed. I'm going to brush my teeth and comb my hair, and then I'm going to go do the thing that I've got to do, and I'm going to push through. And once you get moving, it gets a little bit better. So it's a matter of us learning and developing the discipline to override these automatic thoughts. I mean, part of it's recognizing it, and so you have the thoughts like, oh, there I go again. I'm thinking that really horrible thought first thing in the morning about getting out of bed. Or I'm thinking, through the day, nothing's ever going to get better, or no one's going to talk to me, or I'm going to be lonely for the rest of my life. Versus saying, okay, what's one thing I could do about it? Or what's a more accurate frame? It's like, yes, I don't want to get out of bed right now, but I can get out of bed right now. And I'm going to get one leg over the edge of the mattress, and then I'm going to get the second leg over the edge of the mattress. And then I'm going to walk to the restroom, and I'm going to, splash water on my face and do whatever I'm going to do, and go on from there. So we have a frontal lobe for a reason, and we want to engage that part of our brain that's able to take command of what's going on in our life versus just being on autopilot, which is where those automatic thoughts go.
Well, it goes back to what you were saying earlier about letting our feelings, or being a slave to our feelings, rather.
Yeah.
And so what are some other techniques that people can do or use in their lives to help them get through those tough periods?
Well, we talked about just the basics, taking care of yourself. So eat right, sleep right, exercise. I think engaging in relationships with other people is important. So, set up, times to meet with friends or family members. I think that engaging in your spiritual life is something that can be really helpful for a lot of folks that consider themselves to be religious. So that can involve prayer. It can involve, reading scripture. It could involve reading a book, listening to, music that's supportive. There's so much available on the internet now, in terms of listening to sermons or podcasts of people that can be very encouraging. So part of what one has to think about is, what are you feeding your mind with? So what are those things that you can incorporate into your day that are going to be uplifting? And what are the things in the day that's kind of tearing you down and making it harder to go through the day that I can turn off and titrate?
And sometimes those things can be people.
They can. Sometimes we need to develop healthier boundaries with other folks so that it's like, well, I can take this person in small doses, but they're really just kind of dragging me down with them. So I need to create a little bit more distance. You don't have to cut them off completely most of the time, but I may need to take them in smaller doses and then offset that by getting a good healthy dose of somebody who's more positive and encouraging.
Okay. So relationships, eating well, exercising, getting enough sleep. What are some other things that we can do to address depression?
If the person still has time, doing those things really well takes a lot of time. Plus the other things that you've got to do, during the day. Whether it's take the dog for a walk so they can go to the restroom or whatnot. I think staying engaged in life, reminding yourself that it's going to take time. If we do this for 3 days, it's not going to change everything. It's just like if you go on a diet for 3 days, you're not going to lose the 40 pounds you want to lose. It takes time. So it's building a new way of doing life, going through. Some other things that people can do to really address, the depressed mood. Medication for some folks is an option. It's something for them to consider, so they can go and talk with their physician about that. There are some very good medications that are out there. They're more beneficial for some people than for others, and they're not a good first resort. And really, there's no research to suggest that medications in and of themselves, without counseling along with it, is the way to go. Counseling will help the person kind of work with this. Oftentimes I'll think of a counselor, whether it's a psychologist or a marriage and family therapist or a licensed practical counselor or social worker. These people kind of come alongside you almost as a coach in ways to help you develop skills that you didn't have before, to help you recognize some things that maybe you're missing, to kind of fine-tune how you're doing life. So it's not that they're the expert with all the answers. They may have some really good answers, but they're there to kind of help you figure out what are the things I need to practice over the next week, and then I add one more thing and so forth going forward.
They're the person that can identify and point out for you some of those cognitive distortions that maybe you don't recognize.
Right.
Some of that wrong thinking that's helping you stay stuck.
Yeah, because they're experts at doing this. And oftentimes, I think what's tough for us when we're depressed or just going through our own life is we're not always aware of the thing that we're doing or not doing or the way we're approaching the world. It oftentimes takes somebody else to kind of reflect that back to us. And if there aren't friends or family that are reflecting that back to us, or we don't have a whole lot of people in our life that way, a good counselor can really help with that, because that individual is trained to kind of spot these things and help work with you while you're working your way out of the depression or the anxiety you might be experiencing.
So one area that we haven't touched on too much, and we have just a little bit of time left, is suicide. So if someone is thinking about harming themselves, what would you tell them?
If someone is thinking about harming themselves, I think it's really critical that they reach out to someone. So it could be reaching out and letting a friend know, a family member know. There are, 800 numbers, 1-800 numbers that you can find online that you can call, with hotlines that have people there to talk to you right away. You can call your local county mental health agency. They oftentimes have after-hours people as well, so they're available 24/7 to talk to you and help you get connected with the resources. Or you can go to any local emergency room, and you'll be evaluated and given resources and support at that point in time. So the most important thing, I think, for the person who's feeling suicidal is to let someone else know, and then again start taking a couple of those first steps to get the help that you need, because there's tremendous resource out there for folks that are feeling that way. And oftentimes, if it's the first time you've been suicidal, you don't know what those resources are. You never needed them before. But there are networks that are available that understand all the resources. So all you have to do is touch base with any one of those, and they will get you connected with all the support that you need.
Well, thank you for being with us today. And we want you to know that you're not alone, that there are people out there that can help. So you can reach out to them and do just like Dr. Bill said, and contact one of them. And we'll have some numbers that will come up and show you where you can do that here at the end of the program.